Queen Camilla broke from the reception line without warning. She strode past the waiting dignitaries, past her own entourage, and stopped right in front of the royal guard. "Salute your queen," she ordered. But the guard completely ignored her, didn't so much as even blink. And when she pushed harder, in front of the whole courtyard, his reply didn't just stop her cold. It brought up a name she never expected to hear again. Now, before we show you exactly what happened, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to see will leave you speechless. The pale winter sun had done little to warm Buckingham Palace that morning. A brisk wind cut through the forecourt, carrying the sharp crack of Union Jacks snapping on their poles. Tourists were bunched along the rope barriers, phones already raised just in case something worth filming happened. Even on the quieter ceremonial days, there was a promise hanging in the air that tradition might give way to a moment you didn't see every day. When the history books are written about this day, they'll mark it as the moment when 18 years of buried truth finally broke the surface. When one man's refusal to salute became an earthquake that shook the very foundations of the British monarchy. Guardsman Edward Harcourt stood at his post on the eastern flank like he'd been carved from the same stone as the palace behind him. At 39, he was a seasoned presence in the household division. Tall and broad-shouldered beneath the towering bearskin, his scarlet tunic pressed so sharply the seams could have cut paper. His boots, mirror-shined, were planted on the cobblestones with unshakable precision. But here's what the tourists snapping photos didn't know about the man in the ceremonial uniform. Harcourt had earned his stillness in places where moving at the wrong moment could get you killed. He stood checkpoint duty in Afghan valleys where the silence between heartbeats might be the only warning you got. He'd maintained position during mortar strikes in Iraq, refusing to abandon his post until every civilian in his sector was clear. And there was something else the crowd couldn't know, something that would explain everything that was about to unfold. In 2005, during a quiet assignment with the regiment's protective detail, Harcourt had been working security at a charity gala in Lancaster House. Not the obvious kind of protection you'd see in photographs, but the discreet surveillance that stays in shadows, watching for threats that might come from unexpected directions. That night, he'd been positioned near the service corridors when he heard voices from around the corner. One belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles, as she was then, the other to a nervous aide. "She's becoming a problem," Camilla was saying, her voice low but crystal clear in the marble hallway. "If Lady Evelyn keeps publishing those pieces, defending Diana like it's still her job, we'll never move past this narrative." Harcourt had frozen. Lady Evelyn Harcourt wasn't just some random critic of the royal family. She was his godmother, the woman who'd raised him after his parents died in a car crash when he was 12, the one person who'd never backed down from speaking the truth, even when it made powerful people uncomfortable. 8 years since Diana died, and Evelyn's still dragging her ghost into every conversation, Camilla continued. "Some people need to learn when their time is up, when their usefulness has expired." The coldness in her voice had chilled him more than the February air ever could. Not anger, not frustration, just the casual calculation of someone discussing a problem that needed to be solved. 3 weeks later, the call came. "An unfortunate accident," the official statement said. "A tragic fall down the stairs at her country estate." Lady Evelyn Harcourt, aged 71, defender of Diana's memory, and thorn in the side of those who wanted her forgotten. The family had known it wasn't an accident. The coroner's report was brief, sanitized, and completely unsatisfying. Harcourt had stood at her funeral in full dress uniform, white gloves clenched into fists at his sides, watching them lower the woman who'd taught him that some truths were worth dying for. The kind of discipline that looks ceremonial to outsiders. For Harcourt, it was muscle memory from places where discipline meant survival. The motorcade glided through the palace gates with practiced precision. Queen Camilla stepped out wearing a tailored navy coat. Her expression, that carefully practiced smile she'd worn to thousands of these events. She moved through the reception line like choreography. Then her gaze swept across the line of guards and stopped on Harcourt. Something shifted in her expression. A tightening around her eyes, like she'd recognized something she hadn't expected to see. The planned route had her moving straight to the palace entrance, but halfway there, she changed direction. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in her path that took her away from the reception line and toward the row of guards. Her aides, caught off guard, hurried to adjust their positions. A couple of palace officials exchanged quick glances. This wasn't on the schedule. The crowd noticed immediately. You could feel the shift in energy, that collective intake of breath that happens when people sense something unscripted is about to unfold. Phones that had been lowering rose again. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camilla walked directly to Harcourt and stopped in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him, beneath the bearskin. For a moment, neither moved. The wind whistled through the forecourt, making her coat flutter slightly, but both figures might as well have been carved from marble. Then she spoke, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest tourists to hear. "I believe a queen is due a salute from her guard, Sergeant." Harcourt didn't blink, didn't shift. The winter breeze ruffled the plume on his bare skin, but the man beneath it might as well have been made of granite. Her smile didn't waver, but something in her tone sharpened, like the edge of a blade catching light. "Perhaps you didn't hear me. I said, salute your queen." Still nothing. His breathing remained slow and even, eyes locked on that distant point that guards are trained to focus on. The rifle stayed steady in his left hand, his right hand resting in perfect ceremonial position. A murmur rippled through the crowd, like water disturbed by a stone. Someone whispered, "Is he allowed to just ignore her?" Another voice answered uncertainly, "I don't think so." Camilla's smile began to look forced, the edges growing tight. She leaned forward slightly, not enough to break protocol, but enough to make her words carry more weight. "This isn't the time to be stubborn, Sergeant. You're on duty. Do as I've instructed." The silence stretched like a wire under tension, and stretched, until it became its own kind of answer. Behind her, an aide shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward one of the protocol officers, as if asking whether they should intervene. The officer gave the slightest shake of his head. Sometimes you just had to let these moments play out and see where they landed. "A simple salute," Camilla continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge that cut through the cold air. "That's all I've asked. Show the people that their queen is respected by her guard." The crowd was completely focused now. Phones steady in their hands, conversations dying away to nothing. Even the dignitaries in the reception line had stopped pretending to make small talk, turning to watch the standoff unfolding in the forecourt. Harcourt remained absolutely motionless. Not defiant, that would have required emotion. Just immovable. Like he was anchored to something deeper than the cobblestones beneath his feet. And that's when Camilla's patience finally cracked. She straightened to her full height, her voice now pitched for the entire courtyard to hear. "Is this how the household division now conducts itself, standing mute in the face of the crown?" Some tourists lowered their phones, suddenly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Others raised them higher, sensing this was turning into something that might end up in tomorrow's headlines. "I'm certain," she continued, each word crisp as the winter air, "that ceremonial respect is not optional. Unless, of course, we've reached the point where protocol means whatever suits the mood of the man in uniform." The aristocratic sharpness was coming through now, the kind of tone honed in drawing rooms where cutting someone down was considered an art form. Each syllable was perfectly enunciated, designed to slice. Harcourt didn't move, not even a twitch. The stillness itself had weight to it, a presence that contrasted sharply with the rising heat in her voice. Near the rope barrier, people were starting to lean forward. This wasn't the polite ceremony they'd expected to watch. A few tourists looked genuinely uncomfortable, like they were witnessing a family argument spilling into public. Others seemed riveted, phones steady in their hands. She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "I have always respected men who do their duty, But there's a certain kind of man who hides behind rules because he lacks the character to act when respect is owed. That landed like a slap. Not shouted, not crude, but precise. Surgical. At the rope barrier, a middle-aged man in a navy coat muttered, "Bit much, isn't it?" His wife glanced at him, but said nothing, though her expression suggested she agreed. An American tourist whispered to her companion, "Is she always like this?" The answer came back quietly, "This isn't normal." Behind Camilla, her lead aide was checking his watch and glancing toward the palace entrance. Whatever was supposed to happen next on the schedule was being delayed by this standoff. Protocol officers were having whispered conversations, trying to decide if they should intervene. Camilla's voice softened, but the edge remained razor-sharp. "You may think this is all theatre, Sergeant. Standing in the cold with a gun you'll never fire. But the monarchy runs on traditions like these. And you are here to uphold them, not rewrite them to suit yourself." The crowd's mood was shifting. What had started as curious amusement was becoming something else entirely. People looked uncomfortable now, like they were witnessing something they'd rather not see. Harcourt's rifle gleamed in the pale sunlight, its polished steel reflecting the grey sky above. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, didn't move a fraction on the ancient cobblestones. "A guard salutes the sovereign," Camilla said, gesturing toward him with one gloved hand. "A guard salutes those who stand for the sovereign. That is the law of this courtyard, and it has been so for centuries." A younger aide took half a step forward, lowering his voice. "Ma'am?" She didn't look at him. "Failure to acknowledge your queen, Sergeant, is failure to acknowledge the very crown you claim to serve." The temperature in the courtyard had shifted from formal to personal, from ceremonial to confrontational. This was no longer about protocol. It was about power, about who would blink first. She took a breath. Her next words delivered like a judge issuing a verdict. Protocol exists to honour the crown, not to serve the egos of men who think themselves above it. The line hung in the cold air, drawing murmurs from the crowd. A woman in a wool scarf whispered to her companion, "He's not going to move." And she was right. He didn't. The pause between them was long enough now that even the dignitaries had stopped pretending this wasn't happening. Every eye in the forecourt was focused on the space between the Queen Consort and the motionless guardsman. From somewhere in the diplomatic reception line, a French attaché murmured to his colleague, "This is not normal protocol, no?" The response came back grimly, "Nothing about this is normal." Palace security personnel, positioned discreetly around the perimeter, began shifting their positions, not intervening, not yet, but preparing for whatever might come next. One of them spoke quietly into his radio. "Situation developing at ceremonial post, monitoring." When Camilla spoke again, her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through silk. "Your behaviour is an embarrassment to your regiment," she said, each word crisp as frost, "and an insult to the monarchy itself. I will see to it you are removed from this post before the hour is out." At the rope barrier, a woman in her 60s stepped forward slightly, her voice clear enough for those around her to hear. "That man served with my son in Afghanistan. If he's not saluting, there's a reason." Another voice joined her. "Some things matter more than protocol." The crowd was no longer just watching. They were taking sides. You could feel the shift in energy, the way public sentiment was crystallizing around the figure in red, who had said nothing but somehow spoke volumes. For the first time since she'd approached him, Harcourt moved, slowly, deliberately. His right hand shifted on the rifle's stock. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the dignitaries in the background turned to watch. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard, low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I serve the crown," he said, without turning his head or breaking that forward stare. "I do not serve pretenders to it." The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, a collective gasp from the crowd that seemed to suck all the air out of the forecourt. Aides stiffened. Phones that had begun to lower shot back up. A woman near the front barrier put her hand to her chest. Someone else whispered, "Did he just call her a pretender?" Camilla's head jerked back slightly, her composure cracking for the first time. "Excuse me?" Harcourt's breathing remained steady, almost unnervingly so. When he continued, each word was delivered with the precision of a man who'd been waiting 18 years to say them. "My loyalty was and remains to those who earned it through service, not those who claimed it through manipulation." Her name didn't need to be spoken. Everyone in that courtyard knew exactly who he meant, and the weight of that unspoken name seemed to drop the temperature by several degrees. A ripple went through the crowd. Not just murmurs now, but distinct whispers passing from person to person. An older woman in the crowd wiped away a tear. A young man who'd been filming lowered his phone entirely, suddenly understanding this was about something bigger than a viral moment. Harcourt's voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of something that had been held back for too long. There was a woman who served with dignity, who served the people, who was the rightful Princess of Wales. Behind the rope barrier, you could hear people drawing sharp breaths. Someone whispered, "He's really doing this." Another voice, "Good for him." Camilla's gloved hands tightened at her sides, the only visible sign that his words had found their mark. He continued, each word measured and deliberate, spoken with the authority of someone who'd been there, who'd seen what others had only read about in sanitized press releases. That woman was silenced, and those who orchestrated her silence took her place through deceit. The reaction was instant and visceral. Audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a woman putting her hand to her mouth. Someone near the barrier said, "He knows something," but didn't finish the thought. Even the palace aides looked shaken. This wasn't just insubordination. This was testimony from someone who'd been inside the machine when it was destroying good people. Camilla's carefully maintained composure cracked, not broken, but visibly strained. A muscle tightened along her jaw. The practiced smile was gone entirely, replaced by something cold and rigid. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the winter wind moving across the courtyard and the distant snap of flags. Harcourt's eyes never shifted from that point beyond the crowd. His voice returned to silence, his hands steady on the rifle. But the words he'd spoken hung in the space between them like smoke that wouldn't disperse. The confrontation had transformed from a test of protocol into something much more personal, much more dangerous. For several seconds that felt like minutes. Camilla didn't move. Her aides stood frozen behind her, their expressions carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from their posture. Every eye in the courtyard was fixed on the space between them. When she finally spoke, her tone was controlled but ice-cold. "I have earned my position, Sergeant," she said, voice pitched to carry without shouting. "And your personal sentiments about the past have no bearing on your obligations here. You are a soldier. Soldiers follow protocol." Harcourt didn't answer immediately. The pause was deliberate, the kind of silence that forces the other person to fill it while refusing to be rushed. When his voice came, it was almost conversational. "Protocol, ma'am, is that guards salute the sovereign and those representing the sovereign in an official capacity." He shifted his grip slightly, the tiniest adjustment, just enough to punctuate his words. "Respect is built into the institution, but it is not granted automatically to the individual. Titles can be claimed. Loyalty is earned." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think your interpretation outweighs centuries of—" He cut across her smoothly, never raising his voice. "I've stood on parade for monarchs who commanded respect without having to ask for it, for men and women who understood that the salute is more than a movement of the hand." It's a reflection of trust, of belief in the person standing in that place. He let the words settle for a heartbeat before continuing. Trust, ma'am, is not demanded, and it is not owed to those who diminish the memory of those they replace. The effect on the crowd was electric. People who had been half smiling at the novelty of the moment straightened, phones lowered. A man in a long coat gave the smallest nod, as if in agreement. Camilla's eyes narrowed, but she didn't step closer. Her voice took on a brittle quality. You are out of line, Sergeant. There will be consequences for this. Harcourt's gaze remained fixed on that invisible horizon. Perhaps, but I'd rather face them than forget the oath I took. The statement didn't need volume to land hard. The quiet certainty made it more powerful than any shouted defiance could have been. The oath was to defend truth, he continued, still not looking at her, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to serve with honour. Some of us remember what that actually means. For the first time since approaching him, Camilla's eyes flickered away, just for a moment, but long enough for the observers to catch it. And once that kind of moment is noticed, it can't be unseen. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was decisive. The conversation had already been settled, even if neither party would admit it aloud. Somewhere at the rope barrier, a woman murmured, "He's not budging." Another voice answered quietly, "And she knows it." From the crowd a new voice rose, an elderly man with a military bearing, his words carrying clearly across the forecourt. "That's what courage looks like." Others began to join in, no longer whispering, "He's standing for what's right." About time someone said it. We know what he means. The murmur was becoming a rumble, and Camilla could feel it building around her like a tide. She exhaled slowly through her nose, then turned slightly toward her aides. One stepped forward immediately, murmuring something too quiet for the crowd to hear. She gave a sharp nod. Without another word to Harcourt, she pivoted on her heel and began walking toward the palace entrance. Her aides closed around her like a protective screen, part formality, part shield from the rows of staring eyes. No apology, no final order, no victory claimed. Just a retreat, quiet but unmistakable. As she disappeared through the archway, one of the protocol officers was already on his radio, speaking in urgent, clipped tones. This wasn't going to stay contained to the forecourt. By evening, every news outlet in London would be making calls, trying to confirm what their sources were already whispering. A senior palace aide approached the remaining security personnel, his face grim. Full media blackout on today's events. No statements, no confirmations, no details released to anyone. But it was too late for damage control. In the crowd, people were already uploading videos to social media. Within hours, this moment would be analysed by experts, dissected by historians, and debated by anyone who'd ever questioned the official story of what really happened to those who dared to speak truth to power. Harcourt had done more than refuse a salute. He'd reopened wounds the establishment had spent decades trying to heal. For several seconds after she disappeared through the palace archway, no one moved. The courtyard held its breath, waiting to see if the guard who had just held his ground would acknowledge what had passed. He didn't. Guardsman Edward Harcourt resumed the exact stillness he'd maintained before she approached, rifle in perfect ceremonial position, eyes locked on that distant point. If you'd walked into the forecourt at that moment, you might have thought nothing unusual had happened at all, but everyone who'd witnessed it knew better. Near the rope barrier, the older woman was still wiping her eyes. The man beside her said quietly, "That's the first time anyone's spoken the truth about what really happened in this place since..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A teenager turned to her mother. "Mum, what did he mean about someone being silenced?" Her mother's answer was careful but clear. "He meant some people get what they want by making sure their competition disappears, love, and not everyone who disappears chose to." The veteran with the military bearing approached the barrier, addressing no one in particular, but speaking loud enough for several people to hear. I served 34 years. I've seen good soldiers follow bad orders, and I've seen brave soldiers refuse to follow any orders at all. That man just showed us the difference between the two. A young woman with her phone still recording spoke to her camera. I don't know what we just witnessed, but I know it mattered. That guard just risked his career to honour someone who's been gone for decades. That's not just duty. That's love. The murmurs began quietly, tentative exchanges between people processing something they weren't sure they should discuss out loud. A man in a heavy overcoat said to no one in particular, "That's what real discipline looks like." A woman beside him nodded, still watching Harcourt. "Takes courage to stand your ground like that." Phones were lowered slowly, almost reluctantly, as people realized the footage they'd captured wasn't just another viral moment. It felt weightier than that, more significant. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice said quietly, "Did he really say what I think he said?" The answer came just as softly, clear as day, and he meant every word. Two younger men who'd been whispering since the confrontation began exchanged a look, then gave the faintest nod toward Harcourt. Not enough to draw attention, but enough that he would have seen it if he'd been looking. He wasn't. Couldn't be. An older gentleman near the centre of the barrier straightened to attention and raised a small salute. It wasn't showy or performed for others' benefit, just a private gesture of respect. He held it for a moment, then let it fall. Harcourt didn't acknowledge it, bound by the demands of his role. But the gesture hung in the cold air between them, meaningful in its silence. As the other elements of the ceremony resumed, the crowd didn't disperse as quickly as usual. They lingered, eyes still drawn to the solitary figure in red and black, who had said so little, yet somehow said everything that mattered. Some whispered theories about what would happen to him after this. Others wondered whether the moment would make the news or be quietly buried by palace communications staff. But the absence of Camilla from the forecourt had shifted something fundamental. The space belonged to Harcourt again, and the stillness he projected filled it more completely than her presence ever had. By the time the last dignitary disappeared inside and the forecourt began to empty, the pale afternoon light was fading. Evening was settling over London. But something had changed in that courtyard. The American tourists were posting to social media. The British visitors were calling friends and family. Within hours, every royal correspondent in the city would be working their sources, trying to confirm what sounded too explosive to be true. A plainclothes security officer approached from the side entrance, his destination clear. Not to arrest Harcourt, that would create an even bigger spectacle, but to quietly relieve him of duty before this moment could escalate further. The man's radio crackled with instructions. Discreet extraction, minimal visibility, priority is containment. Harcourt saw him coming in his peripheral vision. In about 30 seconds, his moment of truth would be over. 18 years of silence, broken by 5 minutes of spoken reality. He thought of Lady Evelyn's voice from all those years ago. "Some truths are worth dying for, Edward. The question is whether you're brave enough to live for them." Mission accomplished. The security officer was 10 feet away now, his approach noticed by several people in the crowd. A woman called out, "Don't you dare move him! He's the only one here telling the truth." Others joined her. "Leave him alone! He's done nothing wrong. Some things matter more than protocol." For the first time in royal history, a crowd was actively defending a guard's right to break protocol. The security officer hesitated, looking back toward the palace for guidance. Sometimes the right action isn't the safe action. Harcourt knew what would come next. There would be disciplinary hearings, questions about his fitness for ceremonial duty, pressure to transfer him somewhere far from public view. His pension might be threatened, his service record questioned, but for the first time in 18 years, the weight he'd carried felt lighter. Lady Evelyn's truth had been spoken where it mattered. in the place where she'd been erased from memory by someone who'd been there when it happened. He remained exactly where he'd been since morning. Same perfect posture, same unwavering focus, same unshakable discipline. To anyone watching closely, it was the final lesson of the day. Authority might demand attention, but respect has to be earned. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to move. So what do you think? Was Sergeant Harcourt right to refuse her demand for a salute? Should a royal guard ever break silence when provoked like this? Or does true discipline mean staying quiet no matter what's said? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you that real strength doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit that like button. It honestly helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the incredible men and women who guard these traditions. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that respect can't be demanded, only earned, share this video with them. There's another Royal Guard story already waiting for you on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices discover that they have nothing left to say.